Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai, no mai hoki mai ki te Research Impact for Public Good webinar series. Welcome everybody who's joining us today to the latest in our webinar series, Research Impact for Public Good. My name is Sheree Lacy, and I'd like to welcome you all. Today's webinar is on the topic of socially inclusive stakeholder analysis, introducing the 3I framework. And we are thrilled to have with us today Professor Eric Jensen, who will introduce his work in this area. And I'll spend a moment to introduce Eric properly in a sec, but just a wee bit of housekeeping before we get going. This is the fifth webinar in our series. It more broadly kind of explores the intersections, the relationships between research, policy and impact from all sorts of angles. The session is recorded, but participants won't be visible or audible. The recording will be sent to all registered participants afterwards, as well as being freely available on our website. We will be taking questions at the end or feeding questions to Eric at the end. So as we go through, please feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A box. We also have the upvote function turned on, so feel free to upvote questions that you'd like to go to the top of the pile at the end of the webinar. So I'd like to take a moment to welcome today's speaker, Professor Eric Jensen. We're thrilled to have you with us, Eric. Professor Jensen is a social scientist with a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge. He's a part-time professor at the University of Warwick. I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly, Warwick, where he teaches on public engagement, science policy, audience research, and social research methods. He's also the CEO and Research Director of the Institute for Methods Innovation, where he partners with organisations from around the world to navigate between and across research, policy, practice, and evaluation. The topic that he is going to speak to us about today comes from a very recent publication of his and some colleagues of his called Analysing Who is Relevant to Engage in Environmental Decision-Making Processes by Interests, Influence and Impact, the 3I framework, which was published in the Journal of Environmental Management in January of this year. Now, this is an open access article, and I believe we've popped that already, a link to that in the Q&A box. And you can also find kind of a write-up of this work on the LSE Impact blog, again linked in the Q&A box. We'll also send links to these out when we send out the recording. So with all that said, I would like to warmly welcome Eric and pass it over to him.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sheree. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. And I'm very pleased to talk to you today about socially inclusive stakeholder analysis. As Sheree mentioned, my background is social sciences, and I have university affiliations in the UK and the US, but I spend most of my time on hands-on projects for the Institute for Methods Innovation, where we do stakeholder analyses for EU-funded projects, for institutions, research funders in Ireland, the UK, around the world. So we do a lot of hands-on work, and that informed our approach to this 3I analysis, the stakeholder analysis, where we're trying for something that is both robust and useful, and also can be practically deployed in quite a wide range of settings. So we're bringing together these two things, the kind of theoretical background and also the kind of practicalities of doing stakeholder analysis day to day. So I'm going to present to you the framework today, why it's important to do stakeholder analysis systematically at all when you're trying to develop research impact. And then I'm going to also show you a brief example from an active project that we have going right now so you can kind of see what this looks like in progress. Okay, so when we say stakeholder analysis, this is a fairly long-standing term. And stakeholder as a term is something that's become fairly widespread as a concept. We see it in policy documents now. We see it in, it's definitely diffused beyond the academy into the wider world. And we have a paper that we've published, it's also open access, that questions whether we should be moving on from the term stakeholder, but for now it's so widespread that I think we don't really have much choice but to use it in this kind of setting where we're talking professionally about the concept. But when it comes to externally facing use of the term stakeholder, it is worth thinking about alternatives. So when we say stakeholder, what we really mean is somebody who is relevant. So when we're developing research impact, we're needing to identify who is relevant so that we can determine systematically who we're going to engage, how we're going to prioritize our engagement, that kind of thing. But the term stakeholder can be a little bit vague. So on a practical level, in this paper, we raise the concern that when we just kind of throw around the term stakeholder, we're using it in a loose way that means that we're not being precise enough to develop a high quality engagement plan. So I personally think it's okay in kind of professional settings. I don't think there's a major problem with using the term if you find it useful, but out in the wider world, it is worth being careful. It does have a colonial history. Uh, the kind of etymology of the term comes from kind of colonial history as best we can tell. We discussed that in the paper. So there are some questionable pieces to its background, but also it can lead towards an imprecise approach to engagement planning, to use the term. So when we say stakeholder, we mean relevant. Now, how do we determine who is relevant? That is the question we address in this paper, and we propose what we call a 3I framework: interest, influence, and impact, which also gives us an alternative to saying a stakeholder analysis. We could say a 3I analysis, for example. And when we identify who is relevant, we can be more precise about who exactly do we mean, how are they relevant. So the traditional way of determining relevance, to determine who is a stakeholder from a stakeholder analysis, is the interest and influence. So interest and influence matrices are the traditional way of identifying relevant parties. In this case, we are proposing a third I beyond what's been done traditionally, and that is impact. So beyond identifying who is interested or could be interested in a research project and in research outcomes, who is or could be influential in terms of affecting the impact of those projects. And we also add on top of that who is or could be impacted. So who could be affected, either positively or negatively. And when you analyze systematically those three I's, you get a fairly comprehensive view of who is relevant and how exactly are they relevant to a given project. Now, why is it important to do this systematically? Obviously, implicitly, we will always be thinking about relevance when we're designing public engagement, policy engagement, when we're designing impact activities. So why is it important that we go through this kind of systematic process first before we design our engagement? It's important because we will have a tendency to foreclose on particular categories of relevant parties if we don't take an active process to identify who is relevant and systematically identify who should be engaged as the top priority. So we'll have a pattern of confirmation bias where we already have kind of implicit ideas about who is important based on our past, based on our personal lives and our backgrounds. And that can systematically leave out important people for engagement, which can be a big problem. That's good. That's one of the biggest predictors of poor outcomes is an inadequate coverage in terms of engagement planning. So having a systematic process for identifying relevant parties is a really important step, even if you don't have the time to do a full scale, high quality version. There is a kind of entry level version that pretty much everybody should do in at least a kind of medium sized project up. And I'll introduce what that looks like. The tendency, if you don't do this, is that you end up with a narrower view of who is relevant to your project, and you can end up skewing towards more powerful players. That's another implication that can happen. So some of the things that this kind of analysis does for you, it helps you to identify potentially missing players from your engagement plans. It helps you determine who to prioritize, because on each of those criteria, interest, influence, and impact, you can put a kind of score on them in terms of high interest, high influence, high impact, for example. So you could, prioritize those who are at the high level on at least one of those three criteria, for example. So the particular way that you prioritize can be adapted for a given project, but this does give you a means of systematically prioritizing as opposed to just choosing whoever kind of comes to mind first. It also can be a helpful way of more systematically identifying opportunities for working together to develop research impact. And working together to develop research impact is a really important thing in general, that we don't try to struggle and achieve societal impact alone, but that we work together with partners, with allies, with communities to co-develop impact. This is a much more effective and realistic model of research impact than trying to go it alone. And a systematic analysis like this, identifying who is relevant, can be an excellent initial step to identify who you should be involving, engaging, co-producing impact with. So for the kind of entry level of what this kind of analysis looks like, you can see here this is a worksheet that we have on the website, fasttrackimpact.com, where we have a number of resources about impact planning and impact strategy. So here you can see some kind of simple, straightforward questions that you can ask of yourself or of your team, or you can even get some input through a workshop with others. But this is just to give you a kind of more concrete sense of what this looks like in practice if you do this kind of systematic analysis. So this is the level that you can do in 20, 30 minutes, if that's all the time you have, or a couple hours, or in a kind of extended meeting with external parties or with people in your team. So the assessment is done at the level of particular organizations or groups. So ideally you would be more specific than organization if it's a large organization. So if we imagine like the national government, for example, you wouldn't want to just list them. You'd want to be more specific than that. Like ideally a particular policy team, or a kind of the level of detail that would allow you, if you decide that's your priority for engagement, that you know where to start in terms of finding them and engaging with them. So let's just go through these one at a time to just introduce the three I's and put a little bit more flesh on the bones. So interest, what is for this organization or group, what are they likely to be interested in? What is it about the research that's likely to interest them? How might they have the power to block or facilitate impacts from the research? How might they directly benefit from or be negatively impacted by the research? So that's interest, influence, and impact. And then there's space for notes. The idea is to start to sketch out an initial idea of who is relevant. And this is what this looks like once you start to fill it in. So, in this case, this is from a project that one of our colleagues at the Institute for Methods of Innovation, Professor Mark Reed, from one of his projects. In this case, He's identified the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, their specific program about his area of research, which is peatlands. So identifying how they're likely to be interested, why they may have influence, and then how they may be impacted by his research, and then a little bit of extra notes that would be relevant to planning for engaging them. So the idea is that you do this as a starting point for strategically planning your impact and engagement activities within a project or within a program or center even. So we've done this with research centers as well. So if you wanted to go beyond what I just showed you, that's the kind of entry level, very basic, straightforward, kind of quick start version of doing a 3I analysis. You want to go further than that and do a more systematic version of this, then there are a number of data collection tools you can use. And we provide in the paper some specific examples of full survey designs, full interview guide designs, and a full workshop structure to show you what it can look like, how it can be adapted. So it's a kind of template for doing systematic data collection at like an academic social science standard. So this level of detail, the outputs from an analysis that was this detailed that used systematic methods is actually publishable in itself as a research output. So there are published stakeholder analyses in the literature when they've been done at this level of kind of robustness. So just to, again, give you some more specific idea of what kinds of things you would be asking in this kind of measurement approach. So this kind of data collection is done not directly with your kind of full range of relevant parties, because it's a little bit kind of insider information. It's kind of something that you would do with people who you already have some warm contact with, because it's not a kind of fun, straightforward, easy to complete kind of data collection. This is asking somebody to help you to identify who is relevant to your project. So this would be ideal for people who are on an advisory board, for example. You would ask them to input in this way. You might ask for kind of very warm contacts, people you've worked with before that are outside of your team to help respond to this. And then other researchers may be in a position to provide this kind of insight for you. So you can see the kinds of questions that it's asking. It's basically going through each of the dimensions of the 3I framework in turn and systematically drawing out who is relevant. What are the relevant organizations here? And how exactly are they relevant? That's what this is trying to unearth. And you can get a pretty good view of who is relevant, even with maybe 5 very well-informed individuals. They can identify a number of organizations. Ideally, they have different and maybe overlapping, but kind of different perspectives on the field where you're working. And so they can see from different angles who may be relevant to your work and to the possible impact of your work. If you do this through a workshop structure rather than, which is a common approach, so workshop structures where you bring together those people instead of individually collecting data from them through a survey or interviews, you bring together people who are kind of knowledgeable about the field and would be willing to help you out by participating in this kind of workshop. So again, probably warm contacts. And then this is kind of what you're aiming to cover in a participatory workshop where you would co-produce your identification of who is relevant. So you would have a focus on scope first, so clearly drawing the boundaries so that it's straightforward for your participants to be able to understand who is relevant or not. So to do that, they need to know something about the decision that's going to be made or the project that you're developing. Then you also need to identify relevant individuals, organizations, or groups. The focus should primarily be on organizations or groups because it can create some data protection issues if you're discussing individuals, whereas there's no problem discussing organizations. So in general, we orient the discussion towards organizations or groups within organizations, teams, that kind of thing. But sometimes it just has to be an individual. And then you have the three criteria we discussed: interest, influence, and impact. And you go through those systematically and you get input, and then you discuss differences of opinion. So you first document people's individual views, and if they know the same players, they may in some cases have a different assessment of how relevant they are. So that is resolved through discussion. And then ultimately you co-create a kind of categorization of who is relevant. So once you have that set of relevant parties, you identify what is it that can be a kind of shared attribute that we can use to group people together. So once you have a 3I analysis, whether you've developed it through the kind of entry-level approach or whether you've done a more systematic, full-scale version of this with systematic data collection through surveys, interviews, or workshops, either way, what do you do with the 3I analysis once you've got it? So it helps to anchor your strategic impact planning. So when you're developing your engagement and impact plans, you use this information to feed in. So you use the 3I analysis to identify who is relevant as systematically and comprehensively as you can. You prioritize, and then you start your impact planning anchored in those details. So you focus your impact planning in a targeted way. So this is already orienting you in a better way to do impact planning than sometimes happens. You don't want to be developing your engagement and impact plans in a way where you take a one size fits all approach. You want to be tailoring your approach to the particular groups and contexts that you're aiming to engage. And so a 3I analysis helps to set you up for this kind of approach and to anchor your idea of the impact you want to have in the particular organizations, groups, in particular, kind of particulars as your focus for articulating what impact you're aiming to achieve. What this does for you is it helps you to be more strategic. It helps you to, by strategic, I mean to take into account that you have a range of options. You have a wide range of options in terms of who you might engage, who is relevant, and also the tools you can use to engage them. You will have finite resources and time to actually engage people. And so you want to use those resources, use that time as effectively as you can. And so strategic thinking, a strategic approach is how you deploy your limited resources in any given project or center in the most effective way possible. So you can use this for developing more effective engagement by tailoring your approach based on what you have unearthed and clarified about the people that you're aiming either to engage with directly, or so some of these people that you identify, some of these groups may be the people that you want to benefit, that you're aiming to improve their lives in some way or make them more effective in some way, empower them in some way. In other cases, they may be allies. They may be intermediaries between you and those that you aim to benefit with your research. And so either way, you want to dial in your approach to engagement in a way that's going to be most effective for the people that you're aiming to benefit and for the people you're aiming to engage. And to do that, you need to take into account, in general, context, design options, and power dynamics. And so a 3I analysis can help to clarify systematically, to unearth information about context, about what is it about your project that connects with the context of the people that you may engage with. Can also help to clarify for you what design options for engagement are likely to be helpful or not helpful for this particular group. How can we connect up with what this group or organization cares about? And then it can also help you to think about the power dynamics, because you're thinking about where is their influence to facilitate or block impact. And it also can help with what we in my organization believe is the kind of the core of developing impact, which is empathy. So putting yourself in the shoes of those that you're aiming to benefit or that you're aiming to work with to develop benefits for others. That we think that empathy, that understanding others first before you hope to be understood yourself, is the key to effective engagement and impact work. And doing a systematic stakeholder analysis, a systematic 3I analysis, is a way to start to put yourself in the shoes of those that you're aiming to benefit or those that you may be hoping to engage and work with to facilitate benefit for others. So it's always a good idea to listen first, to understand first, before you go out and present and engage. And so this is consistent with a kind of empathy-based model of engagement and impact, because you're first trying to understand what is it about our project that these organizations, that these groups would care about, and you start there. So when you engage with them, you start with how your work connects to them, not what can they do for you, which is the kind of default scenario. So again, all of this feeds together into a strategic approach to engagement and impact. There are other tools that can be kind of following on from stakeholder analysis. So you can use this kind of analysis of who is relevant to feed into something like a theory of change. So being able to think about who are the relevant organizations, groups, and categories of organizations and groups. This can help you to flesh out and make more realistic something like a theory of change for impact planning. This is one we did for a recent large center grant proposal from a research center based in Thailand. And identifying who is relevant can be an excellent starting point for developing a theory of change, for strategic impact planning in general. It can also help you to identify potential gaps or missing pieces of the puzzle. So when you're thinking about how your work connects up and is relevant to others, you want to make sure that you aren't kind of making a giant leap where you're thinking like, they should care about this, but you haven't kind of told them exactly why and how does this relate to them. So it can help you to identify potential gaps in your impact plans. And in general, it's just a good way of clarifying, where am I going with this engagement? How does this connect up the various things that I'm aiming to achieve? So I'm doing this work to develop impact. What is it that how do I connect up with these individuals, groups, organizations in terms of my impact approach? So when you're developing your engagement plan, this is another resource we have on the Fast Track Impact website. So you can see right in the middle, we have relevant parties as a key element of engagement planning. So who do you need to involve, collaborate, consult, or inform? And how will they be engaged? So that question of how exactly do I start to engage, to involve people in co-developing impact, you have a starting point for that with the 3I analysis, because it already documents how your work is relevant to them in these kind of 3 dimensions. So this feeds into your engagement planning. Ultimately, it will feed into your monitoring and evaluation planning as well, because when you are monitoring and evaluating, you're assessing whether there is progress. So having a clear starting point of where do people stand, what is their likely level of interest, and who is likely to be relevant to the project. This can give you a way of anchoring your monitoring and evaluation planning as well, by clarifying who you may want to collect data from. So who you might want to involve in the data collection process, or maybe even co-produce criteria and evaluation priorities with. Okay, so now I'd like to show just an example of what this looks like. So this is a project that we're doing right now. It's called REM Hub, Rare Earth Minerals Hub. It's an EU funded project where we're aiming to promote sustainable rare earth minerals through recycling of rare earth minerals in the kind of the value chain. So recycling of consumer products, of industrial products that already include these rare earth minerals and magnets, and getting them back recycled in so they can be used again, which then reduces the amount of pressure on mining, which has, concerning effects sometimes. So I'm going to dig into this example here. So here we have from the beginning in this project. So the part of this grant proposal, it's a large 18 million euro project. So our part of it is focusing on stakeholder analysis, theory of change, impact planning, and stakeholder engagement, as well as some aspects of dissemination and what the EU calls exploitation of the actual results of the project. So what we have in the plan for this project around the rare earth value chain is that we want to first understand who the relevant parties are, and then design a way of involving a subset of those relevant parties in developing impact with us. So the idea is that ultimately we are co-producing the impact from the project. We're involving and including others from outside the project in the project itself and in the project's impact. And so to do that, we have multiple stages in the process. The stakeholder analysis is the first stage. So actually we're just kind of at the tail end of that right now. And then we start to do impact planning, which is also done in a collaborative, co-produced way. And then ultimately we are involving people from outside the project through stakeholder engagement, through participatory workshops where we include them in decision making about priorities, agenda setting, about the kind of impact per se. They help us to co-produce our impact agenda, and then we co-develop impact with them. And this helps to give the project a life beyond the end of the funded period of time, because these are organizations that will exist long beyond the end of the project. And so we're able to embed our work in those kind of longer term processes and organizations. So the stakeholder engagement, collaboration, and involvement is kind of the culmination of the stakeholder analysis work, and we connect up to kind of broader approaches to engagement and impact. So the specific way that we're going about collecting insights, we did start with the entry level in a project meeting. We got some ideas down from partners in the project right at the beginning. And then we went beyond that to have a more detailed and systematic view from collecting survey data. And then we're just about to do the qualitative interviews for filling in gaps from what we learned from the surveys. This is the overall structure for how we're developing our work in this project around stakeholder analysis and engagement. So we build on a foundation of the 3I analysis. Next stage is strategic impact planning, which we do using theory of change and a kind of participatory process around theory of change. And then ultimately we have a pretty long process of stakeholder engagement and involvement, where we're going to be involving and co-producing impact with our participants, with people from outside the project, as well as the partners, of course. So this is just showing the kind of entry level where we started. We started with a Google Sheet to identify potential participants. We did not collect names. So in the EU, there is a regulation called GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which sets, I think, very good rules about handling of personal data. So in order to not have any issues with that, we told people to put we told our partners in the project to put their own name down as a contact, so we can have them make an introduction if we want to reach out to a particular organization. But for this initial level of the 3I analysis, we don't need to kind of get people's personal data documented. We can come back to that later. So instead, we focus on that entry level of interest, influence, and impact. So why are they likely to be interested in this research? How might they have power to block or facilitate impacts from the research? And how might they directly benefit from or be negatively impacted by our research? And anything we should keep in mind if we're thinking about engaging this organization or group. So we have an initial set of categories that were identified based on this, based on our data that we collected. So for this particular project, mining companies, waste management companies, manufacturers that use rare earths and magnets, and end users, as well as government and policy organizations, regulatory and standardization bodies, NGOs, and labor unions, because they could be affected as well by potential job production, like increased jobs around this kind of recycling process. And then also financing organizations, maybe venture capitalists in some cases, as well as industry organizations and policy institutions, because there's increasing policy attention on rare earth minerals and magnets as an important part of the economy. So this is just to show you in some ways how versatile the 3I analysis is. The particular paper we published was in the Journal of Environmental Management, so we emphasized the use in the environmental context, but we have used this approach in a wide variety of topics and contexts. And this is an example that's distinct from the examples in the journal article, and a kind of evolving example of how we're using 3I analysis in practice. So just as a final note, we do training on a variety of topics, including this kind of thing, stakeholder analysis, for universities around the world and research institutions and funders. So that's it. I'm looking forward to discussion on your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was great. It was great to have such a robust method, social science method for engagement and impact planning, and also to have really clear structure for how one might run that kind of workshop. I know it's definitely something that we're going to take up at the University of Auckland. So yeah, we'll start working through some of the questions. We have some come through already, but please feel free to add any into the Q&A box or upvote ones that you would like to see put forward. But we'll start with one from Leslie Brooke, who would like to know about, I guess, the snowball sampling method, and with that work. When you're asking people, when you're working with people and asking if they could possibly identify people who were relevant, and kind of introducing or using that method as part of your 3I framework.
Yeah, so just for those that may be unfamiliar, snowball sampling is an approach that's used in qualitative research methods, where particularly for kind of harder to reach groups, ones that you don't have a clear picture of, then you can identify at least one person who does meet your sampling criteria, and then you ask them at the end of the data collection process, after you've built some rapport, you ask them if they could suggest others for you to talk to. So you kind of branch out step by step. That's why it's called a snowball sampling approach. The main concern about snowball sampling in research methods is that you potentially get a kind of skewed view of who's in that overall population, because you're kind of following these particular chains through, rather than kind of getting a systematic view of the whole picture. But sometimes it's absolutely your best available option. So if we kind of bring into this context those general issues around snowball sampling, it is absolutely a useful way of identifying additional relevant parties. But you have to bear in mind that the goal for this is not to gather data from all of the stakeholders. So that would be you engage with the wider range of stakeholders at the engagement stage after you've already done your prioritization and you've identified who is relevant. The goal at this stage is to understand the picture, to kind of get a clear view of the field that you're going to be intervening in, that you're going to be working in. And to do that, you don't have to talk to every individual stakeholder at that initial analysis stage. You just need enough viewpoints that you can get a clear view of who's out there. So absolutely, given that goal that we may only collect data from 10, 15 people, maybe as few as 5, it absolutely is useful to, when you talk to one person, ask if they can recommend another. And the main thing you want to be cautious about is that you're not kind of just tunneling in to one perspective. So if you ask your researcher contact to recommend another researcher contact, another one, then you may end up with like one particular line of viewpoint. So if you can achieve a diversified view, then absolutely snowballing can be very helpful.
That's awesome. Thank you. Hopefully, Leslie, that answered your question. And I want to put forward one that is, I guess, was quite a follow-on from that question. Comes from Kat, who asks, once you have identified the 3 I's, and assuming that no one who's involved in the research has those direct contacts with those potentially interested parties, does the engagement of stakeholders then rely on researchers contacting the parties, maybe effectively a kind of cold calling approach? I don't know if you could speak to that.
It sometimes does. So, I mean, there are particular, depending on the category of relevant party, how you find people may vary. So, for example, if it's policy people, you may find them on LinkedIn. But the particular way of reaching people may vary, but it is often necessary to do cold calling once you get to the stage of like, okay, I do want to engage this kind of category of relevant parties, and now I need to go ahead and do it. And so this is where cold calling those who are like end user people that you're hoping will benefit from your research directly can be both kind of logistically time consuming and challenging and awkward. So this is where it's very helpful to have intermediary organizations involved, ideally involved right from the beginning. So ideally from proposal stage, you're involving relevant organizations that have, civil society organizations, for example, community organizations, where they have a long-standing relationship with the kind of end users that you're aiming to benefit. And so it's a lot easier to cold call an organization like that, a civil society organization. They will be more used to it about interfacing with, kind of the particular type of entity that is a university research institution, for example. That will be something that will be less uncomfortable for them than it would be if you went all the way to, like a marginalized community and were trying to identify individual end users. So I am often advising collaboration, working together with those that have a long-standing relationship in the community, rather than trying to create your own from scratch, which then also brings ethical risks because you may be engaging people for a short time and then you hit the cliff edge of the project funding dropping and then you just drop them. That's a terrible experience for the people that you're engaging with as well. So you can reduce those kind of rough edges by collaborating with intermediary organizations. They will be more understanding of the fact that you may have a limited time frame, that you'll only be engaging with them for a limited period. The thing to bear in mind is that they will, if you're asking them to work to co-produce impact with you, you should be budgeting to the extent that your research funding systems allow it, you should be budgeting for their time, for their involvement, so that you're making sure that you're providing a net benefit to those civil society organizations, those intermediary organizations, so that you can boost them, not be a kind of drain on their resources, so they can help your project.
Okay. It's interesting. You mentioned kind of the ethics of that engagement, because I was wondering, especially for those working within university organizations, where kind of the ethics approval process might come in, and does that have to be in place before making those, contact, particularly with some of the community?
We have a recent paper we published about responsible research impact, that's about the kind of guidelines and recommendations for ethics of engagement and impact. And actually, it's the most requested training course that we offer right now. And mainly, like, we argue that we shouldn't try to replicate the research ethics infrastructure with engagement and impact work, because if we do that, we argue that there's kind of twin goals that we're trying to achieve in ethics, like in ethics of engagement and impact. We want to both increase societal benefits and reduce harms. And if we only pile on the bureaucracy and review processes, we risk achieving the minimizing harms, but then damaging the societal benefit goal by putting people off, reducing the amount of engagement and impact that happens. And so we need a balanced approach that isn't so heavy that it reduces the valuable engagement and impact work that's happening. So we propose a triage approach in terms of governance of engagement and impact, where universities set up a system to identify high risk engagement and impact and focus any formal review processes only on the high risk. And then for the low risk, focus on capacity building, on discussion, kind of having conversations, tools, templates. So like enablement approaches rather than kind of the bureaucratic kind of top down approaches.
Thank you. To go to Grant's question, how does this process, the one that you've set out today, how does this compare with the International Association for Public Participation framework that is used in New Zealand for policy development?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. We will go to another. All right, Janet. Janet asks how you would ensure that you have a diversified view when those at the table may be blind to who is missing. When you are fortunate to have a diversified view, conflict or dissent is expected. Can you please give an example of dissent and the outcome?
Okay, so for the first question, how do you ensure you have a diversified view when those at the table may be blind to who is missing? Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be imperfect doing this kind of data collection. Just as I mentioned with snowball sampling in qualitative research, you never really have full confidence that you've gotten a comprehensive view when you're doing snowball sampling, for example, because you're kind of digging in particular views. You're kind of like going in and grabbing samples in different parts of the field of the system. And so there's always a risk that you don't have an overview of the whole picture. So there are a few ways that we can feel a little bit reassured that we have a full picture. One is by having those diverse range of perspectives. So for example, not having all of your informants, in this case, be researchers, have some, like at least one or two policy informants, one or two civil society organization informants, like by spreading out, that these individuals are sitting in different parts of the field that you're aiming to engage in. So you have some assurance that at least it's kind of a broader view than you would get, even if it's not comprehensive. Basically for comprehensiveness, the larger your sample, the larger and more diversified your sample, the more likely it's going to be comprehensive, but it's always probabilistic. It's never going to be guaranteed that you have a comprehensive view. in qualitative methods, one way that we can identify potential assurance that we're probably getting to a point of covering people comprehensively is what's called saturation. And that's when you start to get the same groups mentioned again and again from very different viewpoints. So like once you start to see like, okay, we're not getting new organizations mentioned here, even though we're asking quite diverse individuals to give us input, that's a signal that you probably reached comprehensiveness. Probably. There's no guarantee. Uh, so that's the first part of the question.
Part of that question, I think it's been hidden out, but from memory, the second part of that question was if there is dissent and conflict.
Yes.
Yeah, how you manage that. Yeah.
So the conflict or dissent is expected. I mean, yes, it does come up that one individual may see it differently than another in terms of interest, influence, and impact. Normally, in a workshop setting, for example, that can be resolved through discussion, or at least kind of they come closer by kind of unearthing their perspectives, why they think this group is more relevant. What will often happen is that some of your informants will have a more detailed view of a group than others, so they can provide additional detail that explains why they assessed people in one way or another. But there's less conflict or dissent than you might expect in this particular setting around the kind of initial analysis of who is relevant, because even if two different informants maybe view the relevance a little bit differently, in most cases they still agree that that organization is relevant. So it's just a matter of like degree. I think I put it at 90, they put it at 70, and that's a pretty minor distinction that we can resolve through discussion, or ultimately the researcher can kind of make a judgment between the two based on what is presented to back it up.
Mm. Great. We will move to Karen's now. We'll come back to the questions about where we might find some of these publications you mentioned before we close off. But to go to Karen's question, so do you plan an impact evaluation as part of your research project and involve the identified stakeholders to co-design this evaluation?
It varies. So, I mean, in the kind of full resources scenario, then we would include an impact evaluation, and we would include not necessarily co-design of all of the details of the evaluation, but co-design at the early stage, especially about priorities, agenda setting, what are the criteria for success, that kind of level. Once we get down to, I mean, so what tends to happen in practice is actually the opposite. So the one of the most common forms of participation that happens in research projects is input on instrument design. So, here's our survey, give us feedback on the survey. But that's really downstream. Like, that's, by that point, the key decisions have already been made about what is important to evaluate, what is it that we care about, what matters, what counts as success. All of those things have already been decided by the time you're asking for feedback on a survey instrument. And so what we think is most important is to move that upstream, to early on get input from the most diverse range of relevant parties you can about what matters, what is important, what does success look like. So that is something that often happens in the theory of change process, the kind of impact planning process, rather than kind of the details of the evaluation. So we do sometimes do that same participation at the level of survey instrument design, but as much as possible, we try to bring it earlier in the process.
Lovely, thanks. And thank you, Grant, for putting a link to that process that you mentioned. I won't put Eric on the spot and ask him to speak to it then, but what I might do is send it on to him and maybe facilitate some kind of response via email. So Leslie, asks, is identifying who is relevant in iterative process as the project is developed collaboratively with or informed by some of those who are relevant.
Yes, it is an iterative process, and it is something that evolves over time. It is important. I mean, when you're doing it systematically, you can't completely kind of trust an iterative process. You do need to front load the effort to identify systematically who is relevant, so that your impact planning, the things that you do early on, are as influenced as possible by the analysis. But that doesn't mean it's fixed and locked in. Just like any impact planning process, you should be nimble, adopting adjustments as you go along based on evolving circumstances and new information, of course.
Thank you. Now, just coming back to the question of where we could find some of your other publications, the Fast Track Impact website mostly has kind of the books and more non-traditional outputs, but I believe the IMI website has a list of your scholarly publications, doesn't, if that's up to date?
It does, yeah. So, thanks. Yeah, the underpinning organization is the Institute for Methods of Innovation, which is a nonprofit registered in Ireland and United States. And there we have a comprehensive set of our publications. Fast Track Impact is a training platform aimed at researchers, kind of by researchers for researchers training.
Brilliant, thank you. Hopefully, Jigyao, who asks, could you give an example of the 3I in practice? Hopefully, we covered that during the presentation. I know that was an early question. So, if there's nothing else, I'd like to bring today's session to a close by first and foremost thanking you, Eric, for sharing your work, sharing your ideas, and giving us some really clear tools as well about how to implement those in practice. It's been invaluable, I know, for us here at the University of Auckland. To thank you for your time. We will make a donation to Trees That Count, that plant native trees across Aotearoa, New Zealand. I would also like to acknowledge the work of Brittany Binbrook behind the scenes, who has done so much to pull together this webinar, not only this one, but all of the series, and has been busy facilitating and answering some of the questions in the background. So thank you, Brittany. And just to end on the note that we will send out this information soon, but our next webinar is on the 4th of June, and that is with the lovely Juliet Gerard. So we hope to see you then. Thanks again, Eric, and have a lovely day, everyone.